Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. We'll look at a variety of stories other than the usual cryptid stories with the Bigfoot, Dogman or werewolves. We're going to look at 14 camping experiences of people who have come face to face with evil, the paranormal, and the unknown. True camping horror stories. Camping isn't as safe as you think it is, no matter where you are or who you're with, my friends. Now it's story time. And I was camping in the California woods. We knew we were the only ones in the area because of the camping registry. We were literally the only people within a 20-mile radius. Anyway, everything was fine and normal, and our campsite was on the shore of a lake, and we all shared an 8-person tent at night. It was a little cramped with 8 guys in a tent, but it wasn't too bad. Anyway, around 3 a.m. we were all awoken the first night by one of our group members standing up in the tent and frantically opening the tent door. He poked his head out and began super frantically and nervously saying, "There's someone in our camp." He kept repeating it, sounding terrified, and we were terrified that someone might be in our camp. We were well aware that we were supposed to be alone. Everyone who had just awoken looked at each other with the most mortified expressions on their faces. After about 15 seconds of saying that someone was in our camp, he lay down and slept as if nothing had happened. He was sleepwalking, and there was no one else in the camp. It was difficult to sleep after that. Several years ago, I went turkey hunting with my father in Shawnee National Forest. I was about 10 years old at the time, and I went on an afternoon hike to scout out hunting posts along the trail. We noticed some blood spatters and drips. But it's nature, so no big deal. About a quarter mile up the trail, however, we come across 3 dogs, gutted, bled out, and skinned, hanging from a tree. Okay. That was strange and frightening. We continued on because there was a bluff not far up the road that was pretty cool to look at. Come to the bluff and you'll find strange symbols burned into the ground and on the sides of the rock wall, candle wax everywhere, and more blood all over the place. My father, who I'd never seen scared in my life, looked at me and said, "Let's go now." And we took off back to camp at a breakneck pace. The worst part is that we never left the campsite. So that night, I lay awake in the camper, terrified at every sound. I'm still getting goosebumps. I'm still thinking about that event. When I was about 18, a group of friends and I drove down to a National Force base near Tallahassee, Florida. We were going to go car camping, drink some ice-cold, naughty lights, and do other 18-year-old things. We didn't want any park rangers bothering us. So we drove deep into the woods, arrived, set up camp, had said natty lights, and me and a guy decided to go explore. So we walked about 100 yards back to the main road, saw another path directly across from us, and began walking right away. We began to notice signs that someone had lived there for some time. Big bags of trash, things like that should have been a huge red flag to turn around, but we were only 18, so nothing could hurt us. So we arrive at this campsite with an older white man living out of his van, clotheslines strung up, coolers strewn about, and a big gorgeous dog I believe to be a golden retriever. We attempted to leave, but he noticed us and began talking. He's friendly enough and asks us where we're from, tells us about some cool places to visit in the park, and we end up chatting for 10 minutes before heading on our way. I kept thinking to myself how strange it was that he gave directions in steps rather than yards or miles. He always seemed off balance, not stumbling drunk, but as if he were walking on a balance beam swaying side to side. And he was ecstatic to tell us about our hometown's national parks and forests. Okay, the camping part was over, and we returned to our tents. Fast forward 2 months, and SD Buddy calls me late at night and tells me to turn on the television news. I do. So I see an old man with a van, and you can guess where this is going, but I didn't, so I apologize to my friends for waking me up and they tell me not to worry, and then I see the golden retriever and it all makes sense. Gary Michael Hilton, who was convicted of at least 4 murders, had no name. On blood, he kidnapped and murdered a girl. Georgia's mountains. Not long after we left, we saw an older couple in North Carolina, and a girl in the same campsite. Yes, it was the same location he had mentioned to us. We obviously called the cops. They put us in touch with the FBI, and we are flown down to the campsite to conduct investigations. Point out everything we saw, tell them exactly what he said, and show them the locations he described to us. I didn't find out until after the trial, but they apparently discovered what appeared to be partially destroyed. Human finger bones in the area had to be flown down again to testify. One winter, I was camping in the Florida Keys. I survived the large snakes and even larger alligators, as well as the scorpions that would get into my shoes at night, but there was one experience that I will never forget. My campsite was next to an old rock quarry that had filled with water and made an excellent swimming and water source. There was also an old dump site nearby, with piles of stoves, fridges, and other random junk. It had been there for quite some time, but nothing new had been added to it in quite some time. One day, a man appears and informs me that they are going to clean up the dump and burn some of the trash, so I should move my tent. So I gathered my belongings and relocated a few hundred yards back into the woods that day. They started burning the garbage, and I didn't think anything of it until I climbed into my tent at night, and as soon as it got dark and I was falling asleep, my tent was infested with hundreds of rats. They must have left the dump due to the fire and were wandering around looking for food. They were all over the place, climbing up my ropes and over the top of the tent. I shook them off, started a fire, and stayed up all night hoping they wouldn't return. They appear to have vanished. So I stayed up the next night, thinking they'd moved on to another dump or something, but no, as it got dark, they'd all returned, bringing some of their friends because there seemed to be more now than ever. I shook them off the tent once more and started a fire. When morning came, I packed my tent and left to find a new home away from those rats. I was walking down the highway, debating whether I should return to another camping spot where I had previously camped. On the freeway. Nearby was a dead 11-foot alligator that had crawled out of the groves just a few feet from where I had been camping a few weeks before. I had had enough of my Florida camping adventure and returned home. An archaeologist, not a camper or a ranger. We were conducting a massive survey, in the middle of nowhere in the interior of B a few years ago. See? All of the crew had gone home, leaving only my boss to follow up on some leads, confirm some coordinates, and finish some mapping. We drive an hour or so from a motel into the middle of nowhere along deactivated logging roads. The nearest town is miles and miles away. We hiked out to this specific location. We had discovered a location a few weeks before. For some reason, the entire area simply fell off. So we get down to business, and after about 15 minutes of hunching over mapping, there's this strange deafening warp sound, and I can feel pressure in my ears. I looked at my boss, who was about 20 feet away, and he was as white as a ghost, staring back at me. Standing it again, I get swamp ear pressure and chest pressure, as if I just got squeezed, chills all over my body, and every hair stands on end. My boss simply stares at me and says, "Let's get out of here." We grab our entire ship and sprint back to the truck. We never talked about it again after that, and I have no idea what it was, but I have never been so terrified in my life, and I still get chills thinking about it 10 years later. There have been many theories and sounds, but nothing quite like it. The best I can describe it is the initial sounds of wings pumping in the air that you hear when a large bird or an eagle takes flight. It was similar, but you could feel it, and it was much louder when I was younger, between the ages of 5 and 11, and my father lived in an old log cabin about 15 miles west of Sheridan, Wyoming, in the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. Every summer when I visited, we would go backpacking and fishing for 2 days in the mountains. Every weekend, we'd park the truck, hike into a remote area, fish for trout along the way, and set up camp wherever we found ourselves. We encountered a number of strange and creepy things, and got into some scary situations with wildlife, but the one that sticks with me the most was an ancient abandoned camp that we came across. We were hiking down a very steep slope, hoping to catch some big old trout in a creek that had been dammed up by beavers. I was on a rock ledge looking for a way down when I noticed the stock action of an old rusted rifle sticking out of a tree where the tree had grown around the barrel years before, higher than the ground. Dad and I descended to investigate and discovered a small cave at the base of the rock formation, only about 12 feet deep, making a nice natural shelter but a terrible place to set up a long-term camp. We discovered 3 heavy-gauge unopened food cans, an old iron cast pot with holes rusted all the way through it, a crusty old saddle and brittle set, and a very old deteriorated heavy wool blanket rolled up and tied with the leather belts inside. We discovered several personal items when we unwrapped the blanket, including a rusted cap and ball, black powder revolver. A leather satchel contained a lead pistol, a powder horn with no black powder in it, tarnished old cartridges, presumably for the rifle in the tree, a straight razor, and, most disturbingly, a shirt with holes in it, half of which was stained with dried blood. As we stood there contemplating what it all meant, it occurred to me at the time how remote this location was. It was the month of July 1985. And the fact that the owner of this shirt had been seriously injured at one point while stuck on a steep slope in the middle of nowhere. I had chills running down my spine. The only thing that gave this fateful campsite away was the pistol and rifle, both of which were made in the 1870s. According to my father, no one will ever know what happened to the man who owned all of this. However, he or someone he knew was obviously shot twice with a gun or arrows. And all his belongings were sitting exactly where he left them, possibly 100 years later. It was highly unlikely he left that area alive. Discovering what amounts to a 100-year-old crime scene in the very remote wilderness gave me the creeps. But mostly it made me sad to know how hopeless and alone this guy must have felt when he died just a few weeks ago. We were on a road trip from B.C. We drove to San Diego, and found a campsite just outside of Crescent City, California. We drove through the campground, which was relatively empty on one side. I noticed a few scattered tents but no one near the location we chose. We had plenty of room. We wanted to go to bed early, so I started a fire with my girlfriend and she began cooking. By 9 p.m., we had eaten, drank a few beers, and climbed up to our rooftop tent with our dog. Or so? I had a difficult time sleeping and woke up several times before finally falling asleep in the pitch darkness with all of our tent windows and campuses closed. Someone whistling outside our tent to the tune of the Saints marching in woke me up at 1 a.m. I nudged my girlfriend, who had awoken and was obviously terrified, after a few minutes of this repetitive whistling. When you sleep here, you disrespect me, and when you disrespect me, you disrespect the you, according to the whistling. Marines? This person would then begin spelling words like F-L-E. We decided to make a move because the verbiage in tone was becoming increasingly aggressive. While our guard dog snored, I slowly unzipped the tent and got my head out. I took a few moments to adjust my eyes and figure out where this person was. Once I could see here, I felt more confident. So I climbed down, and the girlfriend passed me the dog, and she climbed down as well. We flipped the tent up without securing it, and we jumped into the truck, still whistling, to a Crescent City motel. We returned the next morning to retrieve the few belongings that weren't in the truck, and a family who had been camping a few sites over said it went on for another 2 to 3 hours and was the scariest thing their family had ever experienced. I had an experience in Colorado about a year and a half ago when I was hiking up a steep ridge line and my friends suddenly grabbed me and put a finger over his mouth, signaling that I needed to stop talking. I looked to the left of the trail and saw a large white wolf about 50 yards away. We remained motionless for about 5 minutes as it walked away in the opposite direction. I'm not sure if it was worth mentioning, but we slept in the car the night before the trailhead and I recall hearing some strange sounds. It was mostly sounds of people moving close to the car and growling. We slept in the car with the windows down, which freaked me out a little. It wasn't particularly creepy, but it was a strange and unusual occurrence for a normal hike. My friends and I camped in this extremely remote area of southern Brazil, not far from the border with Argentina. It's near a small pond, and only 4 to 5 families live there, in small vacation homes that are only occasionally occupied. There is no cell phone service in this entire region. So we spent the day swimming and grilling and whatever, and most of us are sleeping except for me, who notices a flashlight through the trees not far away, maybe 100 meters at most. I just stood there watching the flashlight, hoping it was someone going to another camp who arrived early. I guessed it was around 3 a.m. The person, a woman, then began yelling in a panicked tone in a language I couldn't figure it out. Some people speak German, and it sounded like strange English. So I assumed it was German. So I woke up a friend who speaks some English. He yelled something, and the person replied again, but my friend didn't understand. He speculated that it might have been Dutch. So I tried shouting in English, but the person didn't respond at all this time. They pointed their flashlight at our camp, paused for about 10 seconds, then turned it off, and we could hear them running across the woods quite quickly. None of us were able to fall asleep again. It was simply creepy. The next day, we went around the pond to each camp and asked if anyone had heard of or knew who the person could be, but no one had. Although some people claimed to have heard the yelling and seen the flashlight, and assumed it was just us being drunk. This is a really remote area where nobody would ever go by mistake, and it's probably my biggest. What the hell happened? I'm still worried that it was a lost tourist or something who stayed lost in the Brazilian bush when my fellow Boy Scout troops saw some strange lights in the sky 20 years ago. We were in the middle of nowhere in Texas, far from any city lights. I don't remember the name of the neighborhood on the night in question. We were sleeping outside, in sleeping bags on cots. And we arranged our cots so that we were all facing the same way, head to toe. I'm not sure what direction we were facing. We simply lined up in the same manner in which we divided the sky into sections, top left, top, middle, etc., and began looking for satellites. We'd been watching for a while and had seen what we thought were at least a couple of different satellites. We saw 3 lights that were not much brighter than the satellites we'd recently seen moving toward one another, none of which were moving in the same direction as the satellites. We were even more taken aback when they would suddenly come to a halt, about half a finger apart, holding your finger to the sky, of course. They eventually shot off in opposite directions, but much faster than they were moving. The first time my husband and I went on a hunting trip deep in the northern woods, Dad drove the 14-foot trailer out to camp and left us there, intending for us to get up super early and secure sitting spots on public land. The camp was about 10 miles from the nearest person and 35 miles from real civilization, complete with street lamps and other amenities. Beautiful scenery. It had snowed, the pine trees were very tall, and it was very quiet outside. We were laughing and talking when something large jumped onto the roof. This is November in northern Michigan. There should be nothing significant in the woods right now. A bear would kill you if it became ill or was unable to hibernate for some reason. We came to a halt in mid-sentence and looked up. Whatever it was had run along the trailer's roof and jumped off into the surrounding snow. After that, I needed new pants. My husband begins looking for ammunition for any of the numerous guns we have nearby, and we both ask each other, what the hell is that? Nothing that big should exist in the woods. We didn't hear anything else, and after a brief moment of hesitation, we decided that we had to see what was going on. We didn't hear any footsteps, but we did hear some wrestling. On a clear night with snow on the ground, you'll hear anything nearby that's moving. My husband was the first to open the door and peer out. We slowly walked around the trailer, being in a small clearing with only a couple of trees, because there was no prints in front of it. We could see about 25 feet around the trailer and went back inside after looking around and finding nothing. It was either long gone or something else was going on, according to logic. It took some time for us to relax, but eventually we both fell asleep with loaded guns on the table a few feet away. We got up the next morning and went outside to take another look around. There are still no tracks other than ours and a few rabbits. We were outside, looking away from the trailer, when we heard it run right across the trailer toward us. We turned around to face our assailant and noticed some snow falling from the pine tree branches and a line across the aluminium roof. The tree branches don't even appear until you're 40 feet in the air. We couldn't have seen them at night because it was snowing. Nothing seemed strange when we went to investigate the night before. We were convinced it was a Yeti Bigfoot or a rage-filled, nocturnal mutant deer with a taste for blood, but it turned out to be some freaking snow falling from a tree and hitting the roof. 14 years ago, my current wife, who was my then girlfriend, and I went camping on the Appalachian Trail in the North Georgia mountains. We camped about 100 yards off a fire road that my truck drove up. My truck's bed was full of firewood. I decided against hauling to the campsite. Just before dark, I noticed that there was less firewood than I remembered. I didn't think much of it at the time because we were a 45-minute drive from anywhere, and I was fairly certain there were no other hikers or campers nearby. However, as it approached midnight, I decided to go get a couple more pieces of wood. My wife was concerned about being alone in the woods, so she accompanied me to the truck. That night, there was no moon. So I took out my flashlight. I also had my firearm with me. My wife asked me several times if I really needed a gun. We heard rustling about 20 feet away in the fire road when we arrived at my truck. I shone my light in that direction, revealing a middle-aged man surrounded by two teenage boys. They were filthy and dressed in tattered clothes. There were no hikers. Consider the film Deliverance. And when the man asked if we had any sticks, I said no, grabbed the last few pieces of wood, and returned to our campsite. Within their hearing, I told my wife, that's why I brought a gun, and I never saw or heard them again. While hiking on a remote trail with my dog, I noticed a man taking pictures about 100 feet down the trail behind us. I assumed he was photographing nature or something. But then I noticed him pointing his camera at me out of the corner of my eye. He quickly turned away when I looked at him. I started walking faster, desperate to get out of there. My dog kept growling over her shoulder as I was getting really bad vibes. When I turned around, the guy was about 30 feet away. I resumed my walk, and my dog began growling a few minutes later. When I turned around, the students were about 10 feet away, clicking away with his camera. I was getting close to the end of the trail, so I started going faster, almost jogging. My dog, a 100-pound German Shepherd, suddenly stops dead in her tracks, turns around, and begins barking and baring her teeth, which she never does. I turned around, and this guy is about 4 feet away from us. I could see my car then, so he had to be jogging to keep up. So I led my dog over to a nearby fence and stood with my back to it, motioning for the guy to follow us. He appeared nervous and lingered for a minute before fleeing. I never go hiking without my dog anymore. My cousins and I rented a cabin in West Virginia for a few days, and every night we would hear some farmers' dogs barking at something in the woods nearby. But I assumed it was just coyotes. I've done a lot of hiking in California and know that coyotes don't bother people. In a large gathering, we went hiking in the woods near the cabin, following a road until it ended for a few miles, then just keeping going until we came to a sort of hill where the trail zigzagged down. I suggested that we take a shortcut and go straight down. So this is where we kind of parted ways. My friend Omar and I went down the hill while one of my cousins stayed at the top to rest for a minute. My other two cousins followed the trail. We were about halfway down the hill when I noticed something white in the leaves. I went up to investigate and discovered it was just a large deer's vertebrae and hip bones. It appeared. My friend Omar asked if it had been killed by coyotes. So I got a closer look and discovered that its neck bones were broken. So there was a better chance of seeing a mountain lion than just a few feet down. We discovered another spine, followed by a kill that was probably a day or two old. It was still covered in skin. It was getting dark, the sun was setting, and we were all dispersed. We were clearly in its domain. My cousins would then panic and try to flee, which is a bad idea. So I told them it was likely to rain and that we should leave before the trail became too muddy and dark. When Omar and I told them what we discovered later, they didn't even leave the cabin for s'mores that night, about a year ago. In Arizona, I went on a 3-month outdoor adventure. We saw a lot of strange things, including the Marfa lights while driving to our canoeing section. An elderly Mexican man attempting to sell 15 people hatchets in exchange for chocolate, or the sounds of elk near our camp. But nothing beats this one strange thing that only I noticed as we approached the end of our 3-month expedition, which was probably the last 2 weeks. And so we began our ISC stands for Individual Solo Expedition. We began the trip as a whole group, but split into 4 groups of 4 in a nearby mountain range. My group consisted of the most experienced hikers. So we gave ourselves a 25 to 30 mile loop over 3 days while the rest of the group did the easier 15-mile sections. The first day went well, with nothing too difficult. The second day was strange for the group. We heard footsteps nearby, but no one was around. About 7 miles into the day, we came across an old abandoned cabin, which we used as a marker because it was on our map. We were going to head east once we got there, but we decided to stop near it. So we set our bags on the ground and began to plan a snack. Approximately 10 minutes into the break, I had to pee. So I moved about 30 feet closer to the cabin and began doing business. While I was standing there, I could look inside the cabin. So I went inside. I swear to God, I saw a wispy-looking man standing inside the cabin, staring at me. He was dressed in an old, tattered, dirty cotton shirt and brown pants, and he had a long white beard. When I saw him, a chill ran through my body. When I saw him, I freaked out and quickly finished up before running to the others and telling them what I had seen. Of course, no one believed me. So they made a few jokes, but I was quite upset by this. I told them to go look for themselves or leave, and they realized I wasn't joking at that point. To be sure, I'm not a big muscular guy. But, at this point in the expedition, we'd gotten to know each other pretty well, and they knew I wasn't easily frightened. I was usually the one who would grab a snake and drag it out of camp, as well as other crawling creatures. But they saw how terrified I was and how quickly I fled the scene. The rest of the day went smoothly until night fell and we all heard those footsteps again. As a result, we all became tense and pulled out our camp knives, keeping them close at hand. We all eventually fell asleep and nothing else bothered us for the rest of the night, but that freaked me out and I still have nightmares about that man to this day.